is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. In today's episode, we're outside in the garden. As you can see, it is a beautiful day. I am so excited about today's episode, but we're going to be talking about how loose soil should be, because a lot of gardeners aim for the loosest soil possible, but I'm here to tell you that that might not be the best tactic to having a successful garden, and the reason why we'll get into. So let's go. So I think we can all agree that loose soil is something that as gardeners we want to aim for. And I do talk about the benefits of having loose soil. But the problem is that there's kind of a Goldilocks and the three bears scenario that goes on in our garden. You see, like anything, there is a spectrum of too cold, too hot, and just right. And in the garden, we do want to aim for that just right. But the problem is it's very difficult to quantify what is just right, because the things that we look for are kind of difficult to describe. And so in this episode, I'm kind of going to break down some things you want to look for so that you can kind of better analyze your soil to see if it's too loose. Because just like I was talking about with the Goldilocks and the three bears scenario, you can have soil that is too compacted, which is not great. That ends up really constricting airflow in the soil. It ends up cramping roots and suffocating roots. It lacks oxygen, and it takes a long time for it to dry out, leading to things like root rot or anaerobic bacteria, stuff that's not very great. But on the flip side, you can have soil that is too loose. I think we could all agree, sandy soil, very sandy soil, try throwing some plants in a beach. They don't grow so well. And so when you have sandy soil, that is on the other end of the spectrum, that's far too loose, and you find that it drains too easily. It doesn't hold on to enough moisture or water. It actually has too much air, so roots end up getting root pruned or air pruned, and it causes root loss. It also has your plants have a really hard time taking up nutrients because there's so much air gaps that the roots actually need to be touching soil. They don't like air. And so when they're working around all those air gaps in your very loose soil, they're actually missing a lot of the nutrients that are available or that flush right from your soil and aren't available anymore. And so your plants have a really difficult time obtaining nutrients as well. Also, conversely, soil bacteria are not present because soil bacteria like a place that is damp, that is rich in oxygen, but if it's drying out too fast, it can't be damp, and your bacteria end up dying. So you really lack a lot of that soil life. The beneficial bacteria and fungi don't like very dry, super well draining soil. They like the Goldilocks and the three bears scenario of just right. So in this episode, that's what we're going to talk about, is just right. Let's go. So when you're looking at soil, there's a few things that make up soil. There is sand, silt, and clay, but we also talk about organic matter. And in the garden, we want to look at the percentages of sand, silt, and clay, as well as organic matter, because it's very important that we look at how much of each there is in our soil. So in this soil here, if I were just to take a little bug. Hello, buddy. What are the odds I can cover that? In our soil, if I were just to take a handful of this and analyze the amounts of sand, silt, and clay, this soil is kind of what I consider to be just about perfect. And in just about perfect, what you're aiming for is roughly about 30% sand, about 40% clay, and about 20 to 30% silt. And the remaining 10 to 20% can be things like organic matter. Now, organic matter can be little punky bits of wood. It can be humus or compost, things that were from a previous season all broken down. That adds humus. That adds that spongy material in the soil that helps to hold on to water. If your soil is lacking a lot of organic material, we have not amended this year, so it is lacking a lot of that organic material, but you'll notice that a really spongy soil is what you want to look for. You don't want it to be too compacted. You'll notice that there's a little bit of a compaction issue right now in our soil because I'm lacking a lot of that organic material that prevents it from compacting. But all I have to do is simply work in some compost from our compost pile, and that will be fixed. And that's something that we recommend doing every single year to make sure that your soil texture stays adequate, because it can actually work towards getting too compacted, which is the other end of the spectrum, which we can talk about later. But we're talking about too loose, because a lot of gardeners aim for as loose as humanly possible, and too loose is not great. And so when you have a combination of sand, silt, clay, and organic material, that gives you a really good ratio. Now, that is only possible if you're using native soil, and I'll explain why. So we talk about the benefits of native soil all the time here on the channel, but one of the biggest benefits is that native soil contains sand, silt, and clay. And the reason why is because native soil is not bagged soil. Bagged soil is usually comprised of mostly peat moss. And peat moss, or coconut husk fiber, that is a organic material that will break down. The problem is it's almost completely void of things like sand and clay, which in a garden is very beneficial. People have been using the benefits of sand and clay in agriculture for thousands of years because they do hold many benefits. Sand provides natural drainage, and clay provides lots of minerals, which are very beneficial for things like plant growth, but it also helps to hold on to moisture. The problem is the clay particles are so small that they end up compacting, and so you need something to kind of prevent them from compacting, and that's really where the organic material comes in. Now, you can ask, well, what about the silt? What does the silt do? The silt is really just kind of, silt is kind of the material that's very light. It's very, blowy. It doesn't really provide a whole lot of benefit. It's just kind of there. It's a byproduct of things like humus and organic material breaking down. It's kind of the really light stuff that kind of just blows around. So in a garden, it's mostly disregarded, and that's why we really want to focus on how much sand, how much clay, and how much organic material is in your garden. And like I said, I like to aim for about 30% sand, 40% clay, and then the remainder can be a combination of silt and organic material, because that's something you're going to be adding every single year. And that is really why bagged soil is something that I don't recommend for raised bed gardens or in-ground gardens, because it just contains far too much of what you don't really need. Now, you do need organic material, but the problem is bagged soil far too often does not even really contain the right type of organic material. It contains things like peat moss, which is mostly carbon. There's not a whole lot of like carbon and nitrogen in it. It's fairly inert. It actually just works as a very stable, sterile growing medium, which is why it works really well for starting seeds and things like that. But it's very poor in the garden. So this bed right here was a trial that we did, just kind of seeing what would happen if we filled a raised bed up with exclusively potting mix. And the problem that we ran into is that the potting mix dried out far too fast because it was far too loose. What you'll see here is that the soil, the top of the soil is very gray, and that's because it just dries out. There's almost no ability for it to hold on to moisture on the top of the soil. Now, we've been working on this. We've been actually amending this with things like compost over the years, and it's gotten a lot better. But you'll notice, see how like spongy this is? This is getting to be the right texture, but imagine what it is now, only like 3 times looser than this. The problem is that this contained very little compost and organic material, and so it has really come a long way from where it was, but it is still way too loose. Now, you should have some level of you should have some level of struggle when it comes to getting down that far in your raised bed. If you can get down that far in your raised bed without ever tilling or broad forking or shoveling or flipping your soil, that is far too loose. That is something where you can basically say, all right, there's an issue there, because there's almost zero compaction at all. And while you're probably wondering, well, Luke, you talked about how compaction is bad. Yeah, some compaction shows that there's components of this soil that has a little bit of clay to it, a little bit of body that's not just going to dry right out. Because come summertime, again, we're working on this bed. We're actually working on making it a little better because it's far too loose. But come summertime, this is going to be bone dry. The water literally just goes just like that, right through the soil. So it dries out super fast. The nutrients run through the soil. So we actually have things like nutrient deficiencies. And the problem is then it heats up really fast because soil that's void of moisture actually can heat up, because water actually kind of saps the heat from your soil, just like if you put a damp cloth on your head when you're feeling really hot or overheated. It helps kind of draw that heat out. The problem is really dry soil cannot do that. So your plant roots actually end up baking. The bacteria and the fungi end up baking. And so while the soil looks really dark, it looks really beautiful, right? It's actually not that good. And so this is kind of what you want to look for with soil that is too loose. You can stick your hand too far down in. There's very little compaction. If you take a big clump of this and throw it in a glass of water, you're going to find that the little bits of sand will sink to the bottom, and then the rest will pretty much float. There won't be a clay layer that you're looking for. And we do have videos on how to do a free soil test at home if you're looking at kind of figuring that stuff out. But you can basically tell from the texture. You can feel, does it have any kind of grittiness from sand? Does it have any kind of compaction quality from clay? Can you see little chunks and bits of wood and debris, which is organic material? None of that is present right now. It's just too loose. That's because it's all degrading peat moss, which is basically just a sterile growing medium. Now, finally, I want to compare that to this. So this is, again, perfect, beautiful soil. See how I can dig down. It's loose, but it's not that loose. I can create a clod, but it breaks up. This does not create a clod. It just does not have any clay in it. Whereas this, it's slightly compacted. It could use a little bit more organic material. We did add kind of some throughout winter to act as a mulch layer, but we could use a little bit more. This is really good soil. Very, very good soil. This is too loose. And so in summary, what I really want to touch on is just kind of what I talked about, and that is that loose soil should not always be your end goal. It should be a soil that is fertile, loose, and has the ability to hold on to some water. Too loose is not always the best. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. Let me know if you learned something in the comments box below and what you learned. Also, if you're someone that feels like you messed up because you went to the store, you bought a bunch of bagged soil and you filled your raised beds up, don't beat yourself up. It's something you can fix. And how you can fix it is by getting nice aged compost, because compost will actually kind of fix a world of hurt. It fixes soil that's too compacted, but it also fixes soil that's too loose. And so it's kind of the universal Band-Aid for the garden. So use that, use lots of it. And then also remember to fertilize frequently. Soil that's too loose has a tendency to drain too quickly. And when it drains too quickly, it basically drains with it lots of nutrients. So just remember to fertilize a little more regularly. Keep an eye on your plants, look for signs of nutrient deficiencies, and you might also have to follow up and water a little more frequently. But it's not the end of the world. You can still have a garden, but this is just a kind of a PSA about loose soil and how sometimes us as gardeners, we try to aim for too loose a soil sometimes. Loose soil should not always be the gold standard. So it should be the Goldilocks, the spot in between. So, all right, catch you guys later. Grow big or go home. Throw a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this video with a friend. Appreciate it. We'll catch you all on the next episode. All right, bye guys.